Whether you call it Kveik, Kvik, or Kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. In brewing, there are a number of steps required to produce a finished product. You can't have wort without a mash. You can't have beer without fermentation. Another necessary step is the boil, during which a number of things occur, though is it really necessary? You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to talk about a unique approach to making Hazy IPA that completely skips the purportedly requisite step of boiling the wort.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the no-boil effect. So this was something I didn't realize people were doing, but the more you think about it, it's like, maybe this is something that we should, do more of, or at least explore. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do this experiment, and especially to focus on hazy IPAs, because I think there's a lot of people out there that are brewing hazies that aren't even boiling the wort. So this is going to be a fun one to talk about. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot in brewing that we, and I think rightfully so, have just accepted hook, line, and sinker as being standard process. And the fun part of what we get to do, Cade, is test all of that stuff out. Now, full disclosure, this is one of those topics that I find to be rather weird because of the acceptance that I have of the boil, which is likely due to how ingrained it is into me to boil wort and all of the good stuff that comes from doing that. Now, yeah, we've been able to show in numerous experiments that reduced boil lengths may not have a negative impact, but until a few years ago, I never considered skipping the boil altogether for various reasons. Perhaps predictably, a style associated with the no boil method is Hazy IPA, and I look forward to talking with you about it in this episode, Cade. Now, if this is a topic that you find particularly interesting, we have talked about it before in episode 85, just not specifically as it relates to Hazy IPA, so this shouldn't be too redundant. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. The YVH discount for this month is freaking awesome. $5 off each 1 pound bag of 2021 Lupamax hops in any variety they have in stock. If you haven't used Lupamax yet, you really are missing out. It is incredible stuff. Our Q&A livecast guest for June of 2022 is the dude who committed to brewing all 99 BJCP beer styles in what he calls the Homebrew Challenge, Martin Keene, who beautifully documented every batch on his YouTube channel, The Homebrew Challenge. Go check it out if you haven't yet. It is an awesome channel. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, June 24th, 2022, as Martin is going to be taking questions that Saturday, June 25th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like, and we're also working on getting them up on our Patreon page as well. Again, that is patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by rating and reviewing it in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. It only takes a few seconds of your time, and those reviews help to make the show more visible to those who may not have heard of it yet, while also providing us with valuable feedback that we use to make the show better. At least that's the hope. Thanks to everybody who has already taken the time to let us know what you think. All right, time for some feedback. Listener Charles Myers from Tokyo, Japan wrote in to say, a huge thank you for the episode on naming beers. I thought I was the only one who took so much pride and put so much thought into naming my homebrew. For me, it's always a stage of life or something I'm going through personally, highs and lows that inspire me. Recently, through a divorce, I've had a regular beer on tap called Dumpster Fire IPA for obvious reasons. Many of my friends love the beer, and it makes me giggle when they come over and ask for a pint of Dumpster Fire. From the personal, I also go to song lyrics and movie quotes sometimes. The more obscure, the better. I even go as far as making labels that I display on an iPad mounted above my kegerator. Thank you for making me feel normal in this episode, as I enjoy that part of the creative process too.
I don't know how excited I would be about drinking a beer named Dumpster Fire.
But if you knew the context, it might make it a little more fun, right?
Well, of course, especially with my history, I can certainly understand why he named it Dumpster Fire. But not that I've never gotten a divorce, but I was, of course, a divorce lawyer.
That's right.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of dumpster fires, Cade.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of dumpster fires. Absolutely. But I think about that beer. I'm like, oh, crap. What'd you do? Did you just like really screw up the beer and just like, screw it. This whole beer was a dumpster fire. I messed up the mash. I messed up the boil. Just do whatever I can. But no, I love it. And we've gotten so much feedback on that naming beer episode. I feel like maybe more than many of the other episodes we've done recently, which is great. That's awesome. I'm glad people are digging it.
Yeah, I'm telling you, the amount of, I say this every episode so far since that show, the amount of feedback that I continue to get on that episode alone is more than any episode that we've put out so far. And we're on at episode 238. So that really says something that people like to hear us talk about topics that I didn't think they'd really like to hear us talk about. Charles, I absolutely love it. I can't think of any beers that I've named, that were specifically based on like negative life experiences. I guess my mind doesn't really go there, but I've certainly got a bunch that were inspired by more positive experiences. I agree. It's just another fun part of brewing to geek out on. In fact, one of the first beers I brewed with my good friend Chris Padalinsky over 10 years ago now, which just blows my mind. It was that long ago, was a pale ale that he designed. This is the one you've probably heard me talk about in the past, where he added the dry hops at yeast pitch, not really understanding what a dry hop addition really was, because it was the first batch he designed on his own. But we ended up calling it Smiling Sky Pale Ale, which was inspired by the sunny days he and I spent brewing and tubing on the lake during that time. I haven't brewed that beer in a while, but even just talking about it makes me feel nostalgic. And that's what I love about a good beer name. And it's just nuts what something as simple as a beer name can do and how it can make you feel. So thank you so much for writing us all the way from Japan, Charles. We always appreciate hearing from our listeners. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we're back from this short break, we'll be chatting about the no boil method and how it impacts Hazy IPA. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. As mentioned earlier, boiling wort is viewed by many as being a necessary step when making beer. However, some, shall we say, experimental brewers of Hazy IPA and a few other styles have reported positive results from skipping the boil altogether. Now, before we get too specific, let's spend a minute talking about what exactly occurs during the boil anyway.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where we should start. What exactly occurs during the boil? But it does bear mentioning the background, right? I mean, as you think about Hazy IPA, that's a style that has this huge charge of hops that's at the end of the boil, right? So you can start to see people like going, well, hey, I'm doing this long 60-minute step. If all I'm doing is adding my hops at the end, why can't I just go ahead and do that way?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where we start here. Is like, well, okay, what's the boil supposed to do? And then let's see if the boil actually actually has an effect, right? So the biggest thing that I think most people would talk about with the boil is most people, especially people who don't understand brewing, would say, oh, that's the kill step. That's the microbial, spot where you're going to get rid of sanitation, right? Or where you're going to sanitize the beer, where you're going to get rid of any unwanted yeast and bacteria. And that's true, right? It does. And I think years ago, like maybe 1,000 years ago, that was an important step because you've got this mash and you didn't have thermometers, you didn't have temperature, you didn't have Louis Pasteur, talking about pasteurization and sanitation. So you just, some brewer out there said, hey, when I soak my grains in water, it makes this sugary liquid. And then when I boil it, it doesn't turn sour as quickly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really, really obvious thing about like why boiling happened years and years ago, because you can physically see the water boiling, right? And that's like a physical thing. But 100 or 1,000 years ago, they didn't know the difference between 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius and boiling 212 Fahrenheit, right?
Well, and when I think about brewing is so rooted in history that it's hard for me not to separate the way we do things today from where they probably came from in the past. And like you said, the brewers of yore were not aware that 100 C or 212 Fahrenheit at boiling temp that's not a magical number. That just happens to be when liquid boils, and it also happens to be when they would do that their beer wouldn't spoil, right? That they wouldn't get this sour wort, that things wouldn't go bad. So it makes sense to me that we would just kind of, hey, accept this premise as being absolutely true, when now with modern understanding of how microbes work, how souring works and fermentation, we can kind of adapt a little bit. But there's no denying that if you've got a vat of boiling wort and you toss a spoon in there or your kettle, the bacteria and wild yeast largely are eliminated because of the boiling wort. So it makes sense that we would just do that all the time, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is one that's a great example of why people might look at the boil and go, wait, but do I really need to do that? Because I think, like I mentioned Louis Pasteur and the work that he did, the reason why there's called pasteurization, right? I think most people understand pasteurization means, heat treating a liquid or a beverage to reduce microbial spoilage or to eliminate, to sanitize or sterilize in some cases that beverage. Yeah. And so Pasteur, he didn't, but I think I'm not sure if he developed this, but we talk about something in pasteurization units. I don't think it was him that developed it, but it certainly came up later. And that's just the amount of time at a certain temperature that you have to hold a beer or beverage to get rid of all the microbes.
Right.
And one pasteurization unit is 1 minute at 60 degrees Celsius or 140 Fahrenheit. 1 minute at 140 Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius is one pasteurization unit. Now, I say that it typically takes 15 to 30 pasteurization units. So if you're just holding it at 140 for 15 to 30 minutes, you could theoretically kill off all the microbes. Now, I say could theoretically because we mash, right? We mash at temperatures higher than that, and it doesn't necessarily kill off all the microbes. But heat, what we do know is that heat, as you raise the temperature, the time that it takes to kill off all the microbes goes way, way down. And once you get over like 72 Celsius, 160 Fahrenheit, it really takes just a short amount of time. For milk, all you have to do for milk is hold it at 15 seconds at 72 degrees Celsius to sanitize, right? And to get rid of all those microbes. So I think that's a really important point and a reason why people might look at this and go, well, I don't need the boil anymore. I just need to raise it to whatever that temperature is, 170 Fahrenheit, 80 Celsius. I just need to raise it to that temperature and then I don't have to worry about it anymore.
Right. Right. And honestly, when you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, what we know, that makes perfect sense. So the argument from sanitization that, you got to boil for sanitization, not necessarily true based on the science. Now, it also does, I think it stands to be mentioned at least, that if you're making spice additions, fruit additions, even hops, which we know have, are antimicrobial or antibacterial, but it will sanitize anything added to that wort as well. Again, overkill perhaps, but a layer of safety that I think a lot of people look forward to. Now, beyond sanitization, there are other reasons or other things that occur during the boil that some would argue, I'm one of those people, are rather important. And I think perhaps the most obvious are what occurs when you add hops to the boil.
Yeah, exactly. And the main thing that occurs when you add hops to the boil is bitterness. And so from a scientific perspective, you have all these alpha acids which are present in hops, but they're not soluble in beer. Okay, they're not going to attach and bind and be there whenever you drink a beer. They're not going to survive the whole process. They're going to get pulled out of solution. But boiling the beverage causes isomerization. Isomerization is just a change in the chemical structure without affecting the actual compounds that are present. It just moves things around. It switches things up, is a way to think about it. And what that does is it creates creates the ability for these bitter acids to solubilize and stay inside the beer. And bitterness is super important for beer because, like we said, wort is this sweet, sugar-laden substance that we then ferment, but there's still a lot of residual sweetness in beer. So people were adding things like spices and fruit, like you mentioned, and then eventually hops. And it's important to remember that the boil came before hops were added to beer, right? That was a sanitation step. But what they realized is, this hop flour, when I add it instead of these other spices like groot and fruit and other things, it creates bitterness. And that bitterness I really like because it offsets all of this nice sweetness. So that's a key role of the boil, is getting bitterness into beer, right?
That is one of the key things about the boil that I appreciate. Now, we've been doing, the whole short and shoddy thing where I boil for just 30 minutes or we boil wort for just 30 minutes. There's this classic idea that your bitterness comes from 60-minute or longer additions, 60 to 90-minute. Your flavor comes from that 30-minute or so mark, and then all of your aroma comes from anything under 15 minutes. I think most people have accepted that idea to be mostly debunked at this point, that you can get bitterness from a 5-minute addition, that you can get flavor from a 60-minute addition, and so on. And so I think it's important not to get locked into that perspective necessarily. That being said, we're still talking about boiling wort for some amount of time, right? What happens when you don't boil it? Can you still isomerize alpha acids? Well, apparently, and again, I am no hop scientist, but what I've found online is that isomerization of alpha acids occurs as low as 175 degrees Fahrenheit or around 79 C. It's just much slower than in boiling wort, kind of like sanitization or the pasteurization process you were talking about, Cade, is if I am able to bring that, you're already mashing it, let's say 150 F, and you collect your sweet wort, you raise it to 175 F or 79 C for a decent amount of time, maybe 15, 20 minutes with a bunch of hops in there, you're going to isomerize some alpha acids. So again, you are going to get bitterness, even if you don't technically boil the wort, but you go through this process anyways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I found a study on this that says that by reducing the temperature from boiling down to that 80 Celsius, 176 Fahrenheit, it reduces the iso-alpha acid concentration by roughly 6 times over the same time period, right? So if you're boiling for 60 minutes, that difference between boiling temperature and 80 Celsius is going to actually reduce the bitterness. And that's a direct reduction in bitterness. I mean, iso-alpha acids are the primary compound that's responsible for bitterness in beer. So that makes a lot of sense, right? That you're going to have reduced bitterness. But, thinking again about hazy IPAs, we don't care as much about bitterness. Right. We're looking for the juicy, fruity aroma. So here again, we see, we have the sanitization step. We also have this bittering step. But why am I doing that? Why am I doing that for a hazy IPA that doesn't necessarily need as much bitterness? Now, hazy IPAs do need bitterness, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but they don't need as much. So then, you start to think about, all right, well, sanitization isn't a big deal for me because I can just raise it to pasteurization temperatures. Bitterness isn't a big deal for me because I'm going to add hops later in the boil, get some bitterness from them and perhaps enough. So what about flavor, right? Is there something that's going to, happen? And like Marshall said, everybody thinks that 30 minutes boil addition is just going to add a whole bunch of hop flavor, and it does. It adds a certain type of hop flavor. But there are other things that come out of solution, right? There are the fruity characteristics that boil out. One thing that sticks around is the oxidized terpenes, or which are like linalool and geraniol, those floral characteristics. But anyway, so we're starting to sort of piece together this puzzle of, wait a minute, there's all these things that happen in the boil which are great for beer styles, and we can certainly see why they're being done. But for the hazy IPA, is all this stuff really necessary?
Exactly. When what you're looking for is, straight hop flavor and aroma in a beer that's supposed to look like it's not finished fermenting. I mean, and I'm not dissing it. I think that is the look people are going for nowadays. Then you really do start to question, do I need to go through this entire traditional process on this a-traditional beer that I'm making? Why not try something new? Aromatically speaking, we already know that you are going to get more of the, what I'm going to call desirable for the style, hop aroma from those later additions. And I know people who, even if they do boil their hazy IPA wort, are making no other addition than at the Whirlpool, at Flame Out. They toss in a whole bunch of hops. They get all of their bitterness, flavor, and aroma from that. They'll do a dry hop later on down the line as well. But again, this classic idea that aroma additions occur at 15 minutes or later, they can occur quite a bit later, and you're still going to get heaps of aroma. In fact, it's been contended that you get more of the juicy, fruity aromas from even later additions than you do at 15 minutes.
Yeah, something I always try to keep in mind is aromatic. Anytime you talk about aroma or aromatic compounds, that means that they're volatile. They're aromatic because you can smell them. They go into the air. They volatilize, right? They're not stuck in the beer. Like bitterness, those isomerized alpha acids are stuck in the beer, right? So when you taste it in your mouth, that's the reason why, one of the main tastes, sour, sweet, salty, bitter, umami, and potentially fat, right? Bitter is a taste because, those hop alpha acids are stuck there in solution. But aromas are volatile, which means they can boil off at high temperatures. And that makes a lot of sense. If you've ever added hops, particularly I don't know why you would do this unless you just enjoy burning money, Citra or something. If you added that as your boil addition, your bittering addition, that's got a high alpha acid level, like 13% alpha acids. That's plenty for bitterness. But if you did that, you're going to lose all those citrus characteristics that make that hop such an amazing one for late additions and dry hopping and Whirlpool and all that other stuff. So, again, we're seeing, okay, aroma is going to change if I boil longer. Flavor is going to change if I boil longer. Bitterness is going to change if I boil longer. I don't need to boil longer for sanitization, but you also have, this other thing called, proteins and tannins, right? Proteins and tannins clump together during the hot break and precipitate out of the wort, which ultimately theoretically leads to clearer beer. That's another thing with hazy IPAs. The whole name is hazy. They don't give a crap if it's not clear, right?
Exactly. And like you said, everybody who has ever boiled wort has seen a hot break, and that hot break is those proteins and tannins coagulating to the point that those clumps get big enough to fall out of solution. When they fall out of solution, it is no longer in solution, and so if there, I think there's a lot of concern, obviously and understandably, that protein and tannins in solution can have an impact on the beer character. But more than anything, let's be real, there's even more focus on the fact that that stuff in solution will result in hazy beer. Well, there you go. Hazy IPA, if it's not having a noticeable impact on beer character, then why not keep that stuff in solution? And I would contend, any type of protein, you think about the protein imparted by oats, flaked oats and stuff like that. It does contribute likely or purportedly to that creamier mouthfeel, or what Brian Hall calls cloudy, like a cloudy mouthfeel in your mouth, which again is pined for in this style.
Yeah. And that color is also going to change because of the haze in there too, right? Those haze particles. If you think about milk is white because there's a lot of particles in there that are scattering light. And that's what's going to be the same with haze causing compounds in beer. It's going to look lighter. That's why those classic examples of hazy IPAs look like, white orange juice, or they look milky and cloudy. And they're just full of that juicy character, right? That's what people talk about all the time. It should taste like orange juice or grape grape juice or citrus juice, in a beer, and that's contributing to it. So you've got so there's all these positives of boils, right? Sanitization, bitterness, flavor, aroma, protein and tannin removal for clear beer. None of those things are important for hazy IPA, or at least not to the level, that they are for other styles. So then you got to ask the question, okay, well, all right, what happens if I don't boil the wort? Are there going to be problems if I don't boil, right?
Yeah, well, and I think I honestly, who's to say that for this particular style, having that stuff present, proteins, tannins, whatever else is contributed or stays in solution by not boiling, who's to say that doesn't actually contribute to a better version of this style, right? I mean, it is a unique style that I think is just ripe for experimenting with. Now, yes, what are the potential downsides of not boiling? We already know this. We've talked about most of it. Lacking bitterness potential, lacking hop flavor if you're not adding any hops, from a traditional perspective at that halfway or mid-boil mark. Potential contamination, though we already know pasteurization temperature is that 145 F or 63 C, higher than most mash temps. Of course, people who are doing the no boil, as my understanding, is that they are bringing the temperature of the wort up, higher to ensure that there are no contaminants in there. Astringency maybe from the presence of tannins from both the malt, the malt husks, the grain husks, as well as the hops. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Cade. You talk about this, what do they call it? Hop burn, in your mouth when you drink some hazy IPAs. I don't know if that's just from dry hopping. Could it just be also even stronger if you don't boil the wort?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, right? I mean, tannins are going to cause all that, right? And if tannins aren't clumping together with the proteins during the hop break, I could certainly see that. You'd get more of a burn, right? I mean, I think of like red wines and that red wine burn from tannins. And that's very similar to hop burn. And I have experienced hop burn a lot before.
As have I. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you've got all of these sort of, potential downsides of not boiling the beer. But again, in terms of hazy IPA, they don't seem as bad, right? They don't seem like they're going to destroy the beer. Like you mentioned, Marshall, maybe they're going to make a better hazy IPA, and right. So the hazy IPA itself, I mean, the key feature is it's got very low perceivable bitterness, and that perceivable character is something I think is important. But it's also got strong hop flavor and aroma, and specifically those fruity compounds, right? That's the key feature to me of a hazy IPA, and that's what distinguishes it from other IPAs is that low perceivable bitterness and strong hop flavor and aroma. Now, I say perceivable importantly because if you look at the bitterness units of a hazy, and a bitterness unit again is just a measure of the isomerized hop acid concentration in beer. But if you look at the bitterness units, they can actually be somewhat high in hazies, upwards of 50 IBUs. And then you taste the beer and it doesn't taste bitter. I mean, I did a whole episode on the Brew Lab with Ross Koenigs from New Belgium, where we just talked about the difficulty of understanding bitterness in beer, and especially in hazy IPAs. I mean, it's all about perception, so you could theoretically even, put a whole bunch of hops and get a highly bitter beer, but then it still tastes nice and juicy. So, that boil, even if you're getting a whole bunch of bitterness in there, that might be a good thing for the hazy IPA again, or you could just eliminate those hops altogether and just go with the bitterness that you get from late additions.
Yeah, exactly. And, you think about what is, when you taste juice, which, I mean, I think most people who are making hazy IPA these days really are using, juice as an inspiration. It does not come across as bitter, but it definitely is acidic, right? And I had somebody explain to me one time, it's not that you're going for no IBU necessarily. It's that you want to hit that balance point perfectly so that when you drink it, there's this balance of sweetness, fruity, and bitter so that you don't necessarily taste the bitterness in the same way you wouldn't describe, at least I wouldn't describe drinking OJ as being overly acidic, but the acid is there and it just keeps it in balance. And that's what you're aiming for with hazy IPA. Obviously, the other key feature to hazy IPA is in its name. It's very, very hazy. And our understanding, at least in the beginning of the whole hazy IPA or New England IPA, as it used to be called, craze, it was, that's just from people, keeping yeast in suspension. They're not finishing their fermentation. We now know that has completely wrong. Obviously, there are some brewers out there who are still doing that. Yuck. But we know that that haze is coming from other things, whether it's the types of grains that are being used, the way in which those grains get mashed and incorporated into the beer, or we know that hop polyphenols and tannins also and proteins all contribute to that haze character as well. You strip that boil, which we know, again, coagulates proteins and tannins and such, drops them out of solution. You take that piece of the puzzle away, and now you've got this liquid that just has all of this suspended stuff in it that isn't yeast. And I think, if you're going to make a hazy IPA, please don't leave yeast in suspension. That's not what you want in there, at least in my opinion. My gut would disagree with it. But yeah, it makes sense to me that if your aim is juicy hop character plus this hazy appearance, not doing the boil just seems to be kind of a natural progression down the road of brewing hazy IPA.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, again, there's always the argument about whether hazy IPA is its own style, but I start to see a lot of the reason why people have strong opinions about this. And it's because of things like this, because you can make a hazy IPA theoretically without boiling. Or, even just look at what like you've mentioned, Marshall, what we've done at Brewlosophy, looking at reducing the boil from 60 minutes to 30 minutes and how that doesn't seem to have a negative sensory characteristic. Now, I think in some cases it has shown a difference, but it hasn't necessarily been, negative. And I think you start to see this trend, especially with brewing. How can I save time while brewing? And if I don't have to raise this all the way to boil, it takes a long time to raise liquid up to boil. If I don't have to wait for that, and then if I can, just either hold my hops, at 60 minutes at a lower temperature, or if I can also cut down on the boiling time, these are all levers that are going to be interesting to brewers, right? As things that can improve their brewing process. And this style, hazy IPA, seems to benefit heavily from these changes to process. And I think that's a really, really interesting thing, right? I'm not going to say it's a complete departure from traditional brewing methods, but it's a very hard pivot away from the boil.
Yeah, well, I remember back, I think it was like 2015, Ed Coffey, who was blogging at Ales of the River Wards back then, he was really into this. Back then, they were calling it NEPA, New England Pale Ale. Obviously, it's kind of morphed over the years, but I believe it was Ed and kind of a group of his cronies who were all into this hazy style living on the East Coast, who were talking about the lack of need for a 60-minute boil. And we had done a few, boil length experiments already, and people were already questioning the need to do a 60-minute boil at all. And people started talking about, well, yeah, you just boil as long as you need to drive off DMS, and then you could do all your hop additions, in the last 5 minutes, or even at once the flame is out, you can make your hop additions. So I don't think you can talk about boiling without talking a little bit about DMS. There's a huge concern about, the boil is where you drive off the DMS precursor so that you don't get a corny or cabbagey, flavor in your beer, which nobody wants that. We have not been able to produce DMS in any beers that we've done, whether that's no boil, 30-minute boil, 20-minute boil. It just seems that modern malts are advanced enough to just where we don't have to worry nearly as much about that. I know people out there will disagree. That has been based on experiments as well as our own experiences. But yes, that is an argument that was made in the earlier days of as we progressed towards reduced boils, lower and lower boil lengths, was that you still need to drive off that DMS.
Yeah, and DMS is very volatile, right? I mean, that's another key component of it. It's going to boil off fairly quickly and fairly rapidly. I don't know exactly off the top of my head how fast that is, but that's my understanding. It's going to boil off fairly quickly and fairly rapidly, and it's volatile at lower temperatures, is my understanding as well. So you don't have to get all the way up to a boil in order to get your DMS out of solution, right? So again, another example of this magical number of 100 degrees Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit, or when you start to see the boil actually boil, right? You start to see the word boil, maybe isn't as important as we think it is. And so that's why a lot of brewers came up with this, so-called no boil method, right? And I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think, what it means, but there's some nuance here, and some of the things that I changed in the experiment to keep things sort of consistent to isolate a variable. But the whole idea is just you don't boil the wort. You raise it to a temperature that you need to pasteurize it, after the mash. So raise it to like 170 Fahrenheit or 77 C, hold it there for a period of time, commonly around 10 minutes. And then that's it. Add a hefty dose of hops, decide how long you want them to sit in that wort at 170 Fahrenheit, chill it, and then ferment it. I mean, it's a super easy and time-saving method, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense why people would experiment with this.
Not only does it save time, but there's an economy of energy as well. You're not, I'm brewing on a 240 volt electric system nowadays, but even when I was back with propane, the amount of energy it takes to bring a batch of wort up to a boil and then hold it there for an hour, and compared to the amount of energy it takes just to bring that wort up to 170 for 10 minutes. I mean, you're saving energy, you're saving time, and you could potentially, again with Hazy IPA at least, you could potentially be contributing to a more desirable or flavorful beer. So if that's the case, then why not, right? And I think it makes perfect sense that people would start going down this path. Now, I've never made a beer using the no boil method, largely because I love clear beer. So, one, because I love clear beer and I want all of that stuff to coagulate and drop out, but I also like a nice bitterness. It's one of the things that I struggle to enjoy about a Hazy IPA once I get past the way it looks, is that to me, they don't taste terribly balanced. I get that that's the key, is that you don't want to notice the bitterness. I kind of want to notice the bitterness in most of the beers that I make. But regardless, you were curious how a Hazy IPA made using the no boil method would compare to one that was boiled. And so you put it to the test, Cade. We'll be going over that experiment when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Cade Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Cade Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Known for its haze and general lack of bitterness, which many believe contributes to its, quote, juicy character, Hazy IPA is arguably an ideal style to skip the boil on, which is exactly what you did in a recent experiment, Cade.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've talked about just previously everything that makes a lot of sense about why people might want to do a no-boil method for Hazy IPA. And honestly, this was one I was kind of excited about brewing myself, right? It is like trying to figure out, okay, does the boil actually matter? I mean, that's the sort of, like I mentioned earlier, it's the whole ethos of what Brewlosophy is about. Why are we doing things the way that we do, and does the boil actually serve a purpose? And I mean, in certain styles, I think there's an argument, but in Hazy IPA, does the boil actually doing anything that matters or that we want in the beer? So I designed an experiment to check this out. The malt bill was fairly simple. I just brewed dual 5-gallon batches of a Hazy IPA in my Brow Supply units. Malt bill was 71% pale malt, 16% flaked oats, and 13% wheat malt. So a nice balance of wheat and oats there, as well as the pale malt. And then for the mashing process, that was pretty standard. Just mashed both beers at 148 Fahrenheit or 64 C for 60 minutes. But it's after the mash that the variable comes into play here. And so when the mashes were complete, I took the grains out and then heated one batch to 185 Fahrenheit or 85 C while the other one was brought to a boil. And I know, while it's not necessarily necessary to hold the no boil wort at pasteurization temperature for 60 minutes. I wanted to do that in this experiment because I wanted the batches to be as similar as possible, and I wanted there also to be enough time for isomerization. And so I think again what we talked about earlier for bitterness is there's a temperature and a time component to it, so I wanted to make sure that if the beers are going to be similar, they're going to be as similar as possible. So this was not a test of what I would call traditional no boil method, which just involves holding it for way lower than 60 minutes, right? But this is a test about the boil itself. Does the temperature of its boil contribute?
Yeah, and I understand when you're doing any sort of experimentation, controlling for extraneous variables can start to make the variable that we are looking at maybe like watered down a little bit. But the reality is you did not boil this wort. There was no protein coagulation. You just held it at 185 F or 85C for the same amount of time that the other batch boiled, which allowed you to make hop additions at the same exact times as well. So we're reducing that variable because it may very well be if you did a traditional no boil batch compared to a 60-minute boil batch and you changed all the hop additions and you did everything. Well, now we can't isolate any differences down to the no boil, which is what we're looking at. So yes, perhaps in the future there will be a kind of a subsequent experiment on the no boil approach. I'm sure we will do this, in fact, where we combine a couple of those variables. But in this one, just to make it clear, we're not watering the variable down. We're trying to isolate it as best as we can. And this was the way that we determined to do that.
Yeah, exactly. The emphasis is on the boil temperature. So adding hops in this, both batches got hops according to the same schedule. So again, one of them's just sitting at 185 Fahrenheit, 85 C. The other one's full on boiling. So 212 F, 100 C. And then hops were added. So I did a 60-minute addition of Magnum, 7 grams of Magnum at 60 minutes. And then like a Hazy IPA, the rest of the hops came at the end. So I did a 5-minute addition and a 1-minute addition. And each of those was 8 grams of Centennial, Citra, and Idaho 7 plus 5 grams of Sabro Lupamax. And so that's at 5 minutes. And then again, same thing, 8 grams Centennial, Citra, and Idaho 7, and then 5 grams of Sabro Lupamax at 1 minute. And so both batches got that. Again, so what we're looking at here is not to try to, change up the timing on hops. It's just to check and see what, the impact of the boil has on this. So when the 60 minutes are up, the worts were chilled, and hydrometer measurements were taken, and there was a difference, which makes sense. We'll talk about that in a second. But no boil wort was I guess it doesn't make sense to me, but we'll talk about why. So no boil wort was 1.049 OG, and the boiled wort was 1.053 OG.
So that does make sense to me. If you're boiling it, you are driving off, you're creating more evaporation. You're going to drive off more of the water that's in that wort, thus, concentrating more of the sugars in that wort. Now, the no boil wort's going to steam, don't get me wrong, but 185 versus 212, that's quite a bit different in terms of temperature. And that boil is going to drive off that steam. It's got to go somewhere. And so it's going out into the atmosphere, thus creating a higher OG. What part of that doesn't make sense to you, Cade?
Oh, yeah. No, I confused myself as I was reading through there. So yeah,
you were interpolating the two. I imagine.
This is where you're like talking and thinking at the same time, and you just mess yourself up. But yeah, that's exactly right. The boiled wort had a higher OG because it was more concentrated. There's more boil off, right? And again, so that's an impact of the variable. So I wasn't super concerned to see this at that. But I was surprised that it was only about 4 OG points, right? That's 1 degree Plato. That's not a huge difference.
No, we did we should actually do an episode on this experiment that I did a few years ago where, all this talk about you got to boil with the lid off your kettle. And so I compared, a beer boiled with the lid on versus the lid off. We won't talk about the results here. We'll save that for its own episode. But suffice to say, the volumes that were left in each kettle, as well as the OG of each wort, were identical. So, the fact that the no boil wort was slightly lower in gravity than the boiled wort actually does make sense to me. You're not creating as much steam or vigor to drive that water off. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is interesting. And so we'll see if that actually plays a role when we get down to the sensory aspects of it. But so then I racked identical volumes of wort into sanitized fermenters and then pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast A38 juice, which is the classic Hazy IPA strain. And then I put both of the worts in, both of the fermenters in my fermentation chamber and let them ferment at 66 Fahrenheit or 19 Celsius. And then I raised the temperature after 5 days to 72 Fahrenheit or 22 Celsius, and then added the dry hop addition. So the dry hop was 28 grams of Citra, 28 grams of Idaho 7, and 22 grams of Sabro Lupamax, which was the dry hop. And so then after 10 days, I let it sit for another 10 days, and it looked like both worts had reached their final gravity. Now, the no-boil wort was 1010 FG, and the boiled wort was 1012 FG. So they're 2 degrees closer than they were at the boil, which I found a little bit interesting, but not super interesting. And of course, the ABVs were different. So 5.1 ABV for the no-boil wort and 5.4 ABV for the boiled wort.
Well, I'll tell you, a 0.3% ABV difference ultimately does not concern me. I don't think 99.9% of people, perhaps even 100, aren't going to be able to tell you a difference of 0.3% ABV. And the fact the no-boil wort started lower and finished a couple points lower all makes sense to me. I do think it's kind of neat, even though we know, yeast are going to ferment sugar. We know that a wort that was never boiled had a perfectly fine fermentation process.
Yeah, exactly. To your point, Marshall, that the proteins and tannins and those sort of things aren't, coming out of solution. Yeast need those, right? Yeah. I mean, there's generally plenty in solution, so it's not like there's ever, there can be protein deficiencies in fermentation, but it's unusual. But the no boil wort's going to have a lot more. So I actually would have thought that it would have done a little bit better fermentation, but it looks to have done the same as the boiled wort. So or at least very similar. Now it did
very similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Very similar. Maybe it did a couple of gravity points better, but who knows? It's hard to say which one performed better. But anyway, these beers aren't terribly different, but they are different. And so, this is also one of those situations where we do see objective differences in measurements that we're taking in the beers based on the boil versus no boil. And I think that's important to point out. So then after the beers were finished, I cold crashed the beers to 30 Fahrenheit or -1 Celsius overnight before pressure transferring both to CO2 purged kegs that I placed on gas in my keezer and then conditioned for about a week before they were ready to serve. These being hazies, I didn't want to condition them very long.
You want to keep as much of that gunk in solution as possible when serving it, right? Yeah. I call it gunk respectfully, by the way. So I'm not trying to hate on Hazy IPA. I drink it all the time because my friend Brad makes a billion of them and always wants me to try them, and they're always good. I don't order a pint, but they're good. Now, real quick, so you poured these beers in glasses. You're testing them out, before data collection. They look obviously differently. One is not obviously, but I think one is noticeably paler, the no boil beer in color based on the photos, and slightly hazier than the boil version as well. So in that respect, it achieved the aim, right? That you would imagine that somebody making a hazy IPA with a no boil approach is going for. It's paler in color and hazier. It could be that paler color is a function of the haze. We know that can be the case, but the boiled beer definitely had more of a copper color than it did that kind of light, milky orange juice color.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we talked about, I would say that they were noticeably different, but we talked about, if there's more compounds in solutions, there's more of those protein, polyphenol colloidal complexes in solution, the color's going to be lighter. But one thing we didn't mention also is just like caramelization, right? Like, caramelization of sugars that are touching the heat source at the bottom of the kettle, and so maybe also contributing to a little bit of darkening or color change based on the boil and the actual heat source that's coming in there. I mean, these were electric systems, so it's going to be on the heating element, not necessarily like gas flame. But in any event, they were noticeably different. And on the picture, there it looks like there's a little bit of a difference in haze quality or in foam quality. I don't know that I noticed that as much when I drank the beers. They both had decent foam. I honestly but didn't look closely to see how the foam quality was, but the color was obvious. And this is one of those where I was glad we have opaque cups, because if these were clear, it would have been very obvious which one is different.
That's what I was going to say. If I'm sitting in a pub and you serve me these two beers in a taster glass that are clear, clear taster glasses, I'm going to tell you I taste a difference because they look so different, right? Now, you would presume, I wasn't there to smell them or taste them, but you would presume just on their appearance that they are different beers, and that's likely going to influence the way you perceive them. Of course, we put them in opaque glasses so that you can't use appearance when tasting them for the triangle test. Now, you did do this data collection during the whole COVID quarantine, and so we weren't able to collect from real tasters. This will be an experiment that we absolutely cover again in the future, and we have done similar type no boil experiments in the past on different styles. But just a reminder, for during the COVID quarantine and stuff, we had this protocol whereby we would take 4 cups that were all of the exact same color, our standard triangle test cups that we use. 2 of them would be marked. You'd put 1 beer in those 2 marked cups, the other beer in the 2 unmarked ones, and then you'd randomly select 3 of those 4 10 times so that the odd beer out was randomized each time, and then you would just mark down whether you were accurate in your guess on the triangle test over those 10 trials, out of which you would need to get 7 correct answers, or identify the odd beer out 7 times in order to insinuate significance, to say that there is perhaps a noticeable difference in these beers that is beyond just random chance in terms of your guessing. In the end, how many of those trials did you actually select the odd beer out?
Only 5. I only got 50% of them right, which is less than what would be required, for significance. So it was not significant. I wasn't able to taste a difference in those beers, and that was shocking to me. I
was going to say.
Again, everything is blind, and I try to stay as blind as I can to the variable, so I know what the variable is, but I'm trying to put all that out of my mind whenever I'm tasting these, and it wasn't hard because they tasted the same. I mean, they both had this awesome juicy hop character. They had that nice, grainy malty backbone and just enough bitterness to complement those really prominent tangerine and mango flavors. And I was like, oh man, this is I don't know if it was the Idaho 7 that just released some thiols or something, or maybe the Citra, or maybe it got some nice biotransformation. I mean, I don't know. But man, I mean, those beers were nice and fruity and tasted great. I mean, both of them were great. Now, it's interesting in terms of preference here, right? Because obviously I didn't taste a difference in them. So I had no preference based on, flavor and aroma, but the one that was no boiled had that nice pale, juicy hazy IPA color, and I liked that one a lot better in terms of the color. The copper beer just looked kind of oxidized, even though it wasn't, right? It didn't taste oxidized. It just looked like more, I don't know, darker, and I just preferred that lighter hazy color.
We know for a fact that the way things look influence our perception of those things. And so I totally understand where you're coming from. I probably would have preferred the boiled one because it looks like more of a normal beer to me, or a beer that I would normally order at a bar, right? It's got less of that kind of murky haze, and you can start to see it's flirting with clarity, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
But I have to imagine that when you were doing this triangle test, full well knowing the variable, having brewed the beers, seen them side by side already, that when you couldn't get them right, I mean, we've all been there as experimenters here, where you're like, what is wrong with my palate? How am I not able to do this? I've seen these beers, I've tasted them side by side. With my bias, I thought there was a difference, but then you blind yourself to the way they look, and lo and behold, they taste exactly the same.
Yeah. I mean, the fun part about this one for me was after I did my triangle tests, right? And so after I've got my results and it's like, oh crap, I can't taste a difference in these. Then it's to look at the two and just like go side to side with color, looking at your mind, and watch yourself convince yourself that you can now taste a difference, in the beers, which I think was a lot of fun for me to just mess with my own mind. But again, because I told you I like that paler color. And so I definitely started developing a preference for that beer, but it was totally a mental preference. I feel like I can share that. It's in a safe space of this podcast. So,
well, and preference is, I think, driven by the gestalt, not just one or two different things, right? I'm sure out there somewhere somebody has made a hazy IPA that I would like better than a clear version of it. I just haven't had it yet, but I'm sure it's there. And part of the reason that my preference kind of goes towards the clear thing is because I, at this point in my life, still prefer the way that looks more, and that's going to impact the way that I perceive the beers that I drink. I'm not going to hide behind my bias on that. It's just the way things work. So now I think one important consideration when we're thinking about implications of this experiment is that this really, you because of the way we designed this experiment, it really only pertains to no boil beer that was held at 185F or 85C for 60 minutes, which likely is not the typical approach people are using, again, to do their no boil beers. They're likely doing it for 15 minutes or whatever it is for pasteurization's sake. And so we can't really generalize this fully, but I do think still it's incredibly interesting that if you don't boil a beer at all, you can still produce a product that tastes exactly like you intended in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that was the biggest takeaway for me is and like you, Marshall, I think we mentioned at the top of the show, I was kind of married to this idea of a boil, right? Yeah. I mean, it's just such a part of my process. It's not even something I would have I'm certainly not creative enough to have thought about, like, oh, what if I just don't boil this beer? But I certainly see how people got there to this. Yeah. And this was cool, right? I mean, this was a fun finding. And this is one that I've had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of brewers about since that experiment. And people were really excited to see this. Like, hey, okay, so no boil seems to work just fine. And I mean, you get even maybe, and I would say my preference was for the one that was no boiled, exclusively based on the color, right, and the appearance. Yeah. But so you're able to do this and brew a beer that looks great like that. And to me, again, I was shocked. I was really surprised. But like you said, there's a criticism of this, I guess, that you could say is what we did was test boil, right? We didn't test the no boil method for making a hazy IPA. Right. We just tested holding wort at different temperatures for 60 minutes, essentially. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But I do think that when you pair these results with the hundreds and perhaps even thousands of anecdotal reports from brewers out there who have made hazy IPA with a 10 to 15 minute pasteurization rest, and that's all, I think, again, it contributes to this concept that you really, the boil isn't necessary, at least in this style, and that you can end up making really good beer with skipping that step altogether, which, again, very novel concept, I think, Yeah,
exactly.
At least among modern brewers these days who are trained like I was, drilled into my brain, you got to boil for 60 minutes or longer.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And I love this. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm a proponent of hazy IPA as a style, is because you've changed the method of brewing, right? And you've created a beer that tastes great. I think if you didn't boil, for example, like a West Coast IPA, or if you didn't boil, for example, an American Pale Ale, you're not going to make a Sierra Nevada clone, right? You're just, right. It's going to taste different. It maybe not necessarily better or worse, but it's just not going to taste the same. So I think, it was really interesting of this modern new style and changing brewing methods. And I love it. I was glad to see this result from the no boil, or at least interested, to see like, oh, wow. I mean, cool. So what people are doing here seems to make sense. Now, like you said, I think there's opportunity here for future experiments too. And so this is kind of laying the groundwork for some of those future experiments that we might pump out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I don't make much hazy IPA myself, and I don't really like haze in my beer at this point. So I'll likely keep boiling my hazy IPA wort, the one or two times I make it in the next decade for 30 to 60 minutes. But I think a part of that also is because I know my system well enough to know what kind of bitterness I'm going to get out of a 30 to 60 minute boil. So it doesn't really shift things for me too much. But we did get some reader comments. The first one comes from Luca, who says, really interesting experiment. And to be honest, I was expecting more difference between the two beers, although the color difference would still be enough to motivate me. Just to make sure I got it right, was there a specific reason for keeping the non-boil beer at 85 Celsius for 60 minutes other than doing a good comparison? If that was the only reason, then I guess it wouldn't really be necessary to keep it for 60 minutes, so it would also be a shorter time involved, right?
Yeah, exactly, Luke. I mean, this is a great question, and it's one that we talked about quite a bit on the show, right? It is, the whole point was just to sort of keep things as similar as possible, just to test the effect of boiling the beer. One of the questions that I have, and certainly I think Marshall has too, is like, what if you didn't boil and did a shorter time versus boil in 60 minutes, right? I mean, would that result in a flavor difference? And as we start potentially stacking variables and modulating some of these experiments, that's something that I think would be really interesting and really useful for brewers, because then you get into more of sort of the nuts and bolts about, what opportunities, what levers can you pull to make the best hazy IPA?
I think the natural next experiment on this would be going with what a lot of hazy IPA brewers are doing these days, which is adding all of their hops at flame out for a whirlpool, is to boil a batch for 60 minutes. I guess you would have to design the no boil batch if you're going to just hold it at 15 minutes with slightly less water, so that whatever boil off happens in the first 45 minutes. But you boil one batch, you no boil one for 15 minutes, but then all the hops come either in the last 5 minutes of the boil or even at flame out or something, for a closer comparison of what I guess quote like normal no boil approach versus a boiled approach. The thing is, then again, we are still looking specifically at what does a boil contribute or versus a no boil batch. Again, there are going to be other things that come into play there, but I think that's a good next step for this variable. So, well, Chris GG says, I'm wondering whether the lack of a rolling boil affected the so-called hop break, which is supposed to coagulate and precipitate proteins from the wort. I guess any IPA makers are not bothered about clarity in the final beer, so the hazier the better. Cutting out the boil would certainly save a lot of energy as well as conserve hop aroma. I made a beer once without any boiling or even heating of the wort. I included the hops in the mash at 65C and found a terrible lack of bitterness and flavor in the finished beer, and had to add hop extract in the end. I never tried again. Maybe your 85C idea would work okay. Whether avoiding the boil would make for a hazy beer is another thing. I prefer a reasonably clear beer.
Yeah, that's a whole different set of questions. Is including hops in the mash at 65 Celsius, which was probably enough for pasteurization, or maybe enough for pasteurization. And then not boiling from there, just raising it to that temperature. Right, the difference in temperature between 85 Celsius, which is where I was at, and 65 Celsius, which is where he was at. I don't know. 65 Celsius also may not be high enough to pasteurize. You may not also care either, right? If you're going to dump Sac Cerevisiae in there really quickly, it's going to take over fairly quickly. But anyway, that's sort of an interesting question. But I think he's also asking about the hop break. And so, yeah, we mentioned that I do think that the hop break is going to change because you're just not getting as much of that hop break to happen. So you're going to have more of those proteins, and that's going to create those protein polyphenol complexes that are going to result in haze. So I think that's definitely the case, and one of the reasons. One of the other things that I forgot to mention that we didn't talk about is just the concentration of the wort, right? I mean, that's also going to change the color and the way that the beer appears. So just concentrating that wort also is going to impact the way that the beer looks.
I was thinking about the whole hop break thing, and I'd be so curious to, we're starting to get into, after 7 years of doing experiments, we're starting to finally get into combined variable experiments and hoping to kind of open that box here soon. What would the difference between, say, a no boil beer that is made with like 50% flaked oats versus a no boil beer that's made with 100% pale malt, or even a boiled beer that's made with 100% pale malt? It'd be really interesting to me to see what type of impact that has on the appearance, because I feel like with hazy IPA, the appearance is such a big component to it that, what if you can, create this kind of thicker juice looking beer that doesn't have again, I keep saying this, but isn't hazy because of the yeast and poor process, but because of the actual process that you're using actually contributes to that appearance. I just think it'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, I mean, those materials are going to have different protein concentrations. So yeah, I mean, I would think that would make some difference in the way that it comes out. I don't know what difference that would be, but it'd be fun to look at.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, what we can say here, like I said, is that when you hold, a hazy IPA wort at 185 Fahrenheit or 85 C for an hour, it seems to produce a beer with similar perceptible qualities as one that's boiled for 60 minutes. So very interesting for those of you out there who are struggling to maintain a stable haze in your hazy IPA. Maybe give this no boil approach a shot. Well, that is all we've got on using the no boil method with hazy IPA. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Cade?
No, I think that's it. I mean, we discussed it a lot, and I'm excited about future experiments in this, but also just the takeaway from this one that you can make a wonderful batch of hazy IPA without boiling the wort. I just think that's a really cool thing that we can use to go forward. And who knows, maybe there's other styles that might benefit from a no boil method.
Absolutely, I'm thinking about Hefeweizen.
Yeah, right. That's a good one.
All right. Well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.